Good evening, everybody. My name is Anthony Crupi, and I'm a wildlife research biologist with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and I'm based in Juneau. It's remarkable to see how many people have tuned in from really all over the country and such warm places. It's great to bring you back into a little bit of the cold that we're feeling here in Southeast. Thank you to all who've organized these virtual wildlife series. If you've missed any of the previous presentations, you can access them on our YouTube page. I'm very excited to share with you tonight some of the spectacular intricacies of brown bear denning ecology. The photo illustrated here is just phenomenal to me. It's taken by a photographer up in the Yukon named Peter Mather, where he was able to capture brown bears fishing for salmon beneath the lights of the aurora. In these dark days of winter, the extreme cold temperatures freeze on the water on their fur, and it's been said that these bears sound like wind chimes as they move through the landscape. An image that truly stimulates all of my senses. It's just fantastic. Abby, you've got the waiting room, it looks like. Okay. So before I begin, I must acknowledge that I'm privileged to be the face of this effort, but it is very much a collaborative project. It would not be possible for me to have done this alone. I'm indebted to countless biologists, technicians, volunteers for their time, effort, and dedication to improving our knowledge of brown bear ecosystems. This week, I celebrate with my wife, Lori, our first 25 years together, which also marks the passage of our time in Southeast. I'm sure our parents thought we were crazy when we set off from Anchorage on a 3-day road trip to Haines, and we returned to quit our jobs and ended up moving there. Since then, we've established our roots in Southeast, raised 3 dogs and 2 wonderful children that we now enjoy exploring and sailing the wilds of the land and sea of Southeast. 20 years ago, I earned my master's degree at Utah State University with Barry Gilbert, a fellow Duke alumni, studying bear behavior in Southeast Alaska. This work belongs to all of us, and I have the pleasure of presenting that information to you, but it's a huge collaborative team effort. So I'll start with a general overview of tonight's presentation. I'm going to introduce you to this intricate coastal rainforest ecosystem that these bears live and thrive in. I'll give you a little bit of a historical perspective. We'll touch on the brown bear life cycle throughout the year. We'll speak about denning ecology in depth, and I'll take you into some of these dens that probably most of you have never been able to see before, and give you an idea on what it is that bears are looking for when they decide where to den. So I work for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and the mission of the division that I work for, the Division of Wildlife Conservation, is to conserve and enhance Alaska's wildlife and habitats and provide for a wide range of benefits and public uses. Essentially, ADF&G is responsible for maintaining these habitats and managing for sustainable populations. So where are we going to be spending our time tonight? We're going to be along the southern edge of Alaska, where the Pacific Ocean meets the rugged topography of the Coast Mountain Range. It stands as one of our most treasured public lands. It's a landscape dominated by ancient towering trees and water. Tonight, I will transport you deep into the backcountry of our largest national forest, the Tongass. Life in the Tongass, it depends on salmon. It's one of the places that when I close my eyes, I'm transported to a wet fall scene where I can see the rain dripping from the enormous spruce trees, hear the sounds of gulls flooding the river, and the sweet smell of pungent, decaying salmon. But first off, I need to tribute the cadre of wildlife biologists who pioneered this research in Southeast Alaska, studying bears and their denning ecology. I've learned so much from their historical perspectives. On the left here, you can see Laverne Beyer, still a close friend, emerging from one of these dens full of snow back in the early 80s. John Shane, who he started these projects on Admiralty and Chichikov Islands with. Kim Titus, who worked for years for the department and just now recently has retired to move on to doing things like deer hunting and king salmon fishing. And I also owe much to Rod Flynn, who I worked closely with as I started my career here at Fish and Game. As more of this historical perspective, where we now use GPS collars to locate dens, at one time, Laverne and John would locate the den of a collared bear while they were flying around in an airplane using radio telemetry with a VHF signal. And they'd get to where they think that the den was the strongest, where the bear was the strongest, and they would drop an old deer collar attached to an anchor down near the den so that they could come back in the summer to try to investigate that den. Here's another picture of where you can see that they were measuring snow depths on the top of a mountain and had to dig down into where the den was actually located. I'll show you this map here, which details the various study areas and the time periods where we've conducted brown bear research in Southeast over the last 4 decades. A lot of time we get the question of, well, why do we even study brown bears? And essentially this research is generally related to conservation concerns, and we collect the biological information that's necessary to sustainably manage the populations. Over the years, this research has been related to mining, timber harvest, proposed roads, and other development projects. We often strive to determine population abundance and set appropriate management guidelines in these areas. Most currently, I'm working up in Northern Lynn Canal in the Haines-Skagway area since 2018. I want to first walk you through kind of the annual life history of brown bears in Southeast. So as you start on the left side of the figure here, you can see bears are emerging from their dens late March into April as the landscape begins to green up and the snow melts away. Bears are moving down the hillsides into these estuaries which are full of grasses and sedges. And this is really when bears are starting to put on the first bits of protein after a long time in the den. During May, June, and into early July is the breeding season, followed by, you can see the salmon enter into the ecosystem. And as these salmon enter into the ecosystem, bears are really trying to put on all the fat that they need to be able to survive another winter denning. And you can see that kind of as you get into November and December, most of these bears are entering their winter lairs. So as I've said, salmon are the lifeblood of this ecosystem. Brown bears on the coast, grizzly bears in the interior, they're the same species, and they're both known for being ecosystem engineers, depending on the place in which they live. In Southeast, Pacific salmon collect the marine nutrients while they're in the ocean, and when they return to freshwater to spawn, brown bears capture and consume them, and they in turn fertilize the forests that are so healthy that we have here in Southeast. As they urinate and defecate and transport carcasses, it's been shown that salmon-supported ecosystems have spruce trees that grow larger than in watersheds where bears do not inhabit. Here you can see an example of a bear peeling back the skin of the salmon and eating it. And bears essentially are targeting the fattest, most lipid-rich parts of those salmon. So they're targeting the brain, they're targeting the skin, and when it's a female, they'll consume the eggs. Sometimes you'll see a lot of selection where a bear will catch a fish, and if it is not a female, oftentimes you'll see them put that back and continue to forage until they can catch a female. I've seen them step on the bellies of salmon like it's a tube of toothpaste, and as the eggs squirt out, they lap those up. It's this fat that they need that is so necessary for them to be able to survive hibernation. And if they catch live fish, they have about 80% more fat than if they're just able to consume dead carcasses. When bears do consume these large amounts of salmon and in other places meat, brown bears have been shown to attain larger body masses, produce more offspring, and actually live at higher population densities. This graphic was created by our education team, and it helps illustrate the reality of what we mean when we say brown bears have low reproductive and recruitment rates. Fun fact, you'll often hear from Laverne, brown bears are the second slowest reproducing land mammal in North America, second only to, there's usually a pause, the muskox. Based on the demographic data we've collected in Haines and Yakutat, female bears' first stage of reproduction is 5 years old. On Admiralty, it was closer to 7. On average, I'll kind of walk you through this chart here. She'll give birth to 2 cubs, and just more than half of those will survive. Once those juvenile bears are on their own, survival until reproductive age is still a challenge. At best case scenario, she replaces herself when she's 10 years old. If she were to successfully breed and raise cubs at every interval over the course of her reproductive lifespan, we could expect 4 of her offspring, half male, half female, to survive to adulthood. However, in this hunted population, I've got an example from up in Haines and Game Management Unit 1D, the average age of harvested female bears is about 10 years old. So we should expect stable populations, but management becomes a challenge during years when food resources are limited. Brown bears have adapted remarkable metabolic strategies, including enormous fat accumulation during the hyperphagia period. Extreme changes in body condition during a short period of time can be achieved. I like using this bear as an example here. It's on the photo on the left is a bear at Brooks Falls, bear number 435 in July 2019. The photo on the right is of the same bear later in October after summer feeding on sockeye. She reared 1 cub the following spring of 2020. I remember back in 2001 in September, watching an adult female bear capture and partially consume 15 pink salmon in a 45-minute foraging bout, only to return that same evening and do the same thing all over again. It's really a true testament to a bear's need to put on enough fat to be able to survive winter. So we've conducted several brown bear research projects in Southeast Alaska. This involves typically capturing and collaring bears to learn about their habitat use, their survival, their reproductive rates. We mark bears in the study areas in different habitats, and ultimately to manage the population sustainably, we estimate the density and abundance of that population. We collect biological samples to study population genetics and can learn about their diets using stable isotopes. Shown here is an example of a Tailonix GPS collar that we use to track the bear movements. These collars store the data in the collar, so each one needs to be recovered using radio telemetry. On the top right, you can see a small black device that is programmed to release the collar from the bear on a specific date and time. These collars collect a GPS location every 20 minutes during the active season and 1 location per day during the denning season to preserve the battery life. It also collects temperature and activity data at 10-minute intervals. To cope with the harsh conditions of winter, several mammal species have adapted hibernation strategies that enable them to survive periods of unfavorable weather and limited food resources. During hibernation, brown bears go months without eating, drinking, or passing waste. They essentially slow everything down to conserve energy and burn the fat that they stored during hyperphagia. I refer to this period as hibernation, though more accurately, the term is torpor. It is simply a period of dormancy, as bears are not true hibernators. In true hibernators, such as ground squirrels, body temperatures drop to near freezing and metabolisms decrease by as much as 90%. Brown bears use dens for hibernation and parturition, and therefore den sites are an important aspect of their life cycle. A den allows a bear to conserve energy and heat and provides safety to females that give their birth to their cubs in the den. They need to choose a location for their den site that accumulates snow for thermal insulation, yet stays relatively cool so that it does not flood come spring sunshine that melts the snow and leaves the den very damp. The combined costs of gestation and lactation during hibernation place large energetic demands on these female bears. Bears conserve energy by reducing their body temperature by 10 degrees, their heart rate by 25%, and their metabolism decreases by more than 50%. Their winter survival depends on accumulating the ample fat reserves prior to entering the den. They lose about 1/4 to half of their body mass, and they don't urinate or defecate while they're in the den. They recycle this waste into amino acids and proteins and emerge from hibernation with minimal loss to their muscle mass and their bone density. It's really a unique adaptation that has created great interest for human health, for things like hospitalized patients and things like space travel. So just to give you a quick introduction to other species, tonight I'll be focusing on brown bear denning, but it's important to recognize that different species utilize a variety of denning strategies. For example, with polar bears, dens are exclusively used by reproductive females who are seeking refuge to give birth to their cubs. In black bears, on the other hand, they use a wide variety of den types. An example seen here on the right is a large diameter tree that is hollow in the middle, and the bear that used this den climbed up into the tree to the visible hole and then nested in the cavity down at the base of the tree. This is an exciting video that I was able to download from Washington State University Bear Center. In it, you can see several research animals, and the one in the middle is excavating a den by digging into the earth. Not done yet. I really miss the sense of not having everyone in the room with me. I'm in this empty conference room here at our office at Fish and Game, and to see the smiles on people's faces as they are able to interact and see some of these things with bears, I really look forward to being able to share these things and be able to talk about them afterwards. So this is another exciting short clip that I was able to get for you tonight. One of the PhD students at Washington State University that many of you likely know is Tony Carnahan. He worked in Anchorage for Fish and Game for a number of years. Using his iPhone and a program called Sketchfab, he was able to create this 3D model of one of those dens that a bear dug. This den is 15 feet deep, 4 feet high at the greatest point inside. And it really just gives you a sense of, once they create this opening to the den, there's typically a long tunnel that leads back into a den chamber. It's not always that way, but this is typical of many of the excavated dens that we see. Now for the bear's eye view, so to speak. Notice the roots in the ceiling and the claw patterns in the dirt. I just think it's so cool that he was able to create this and allowed me to share it tonight. So here's another map of Southeast Alaska, and you can see all these different colors on there. And what this is these are all the dens that we've located in Southeast since 2004. Totaling more than 300 dens. The map kind of shows you their general distribution, and they're color coded by the study area. The dens I will describe tonight cover a wide range of den types observed in Southeast. But this note by is no means intended to ignore the other den types that exist in other ecotypes. For instance, up in the north, Dick Scheidler has studied dens in the Arctic, where bears dig dens in the permafrost landforms called pingos. And it's a very different selection pattern than what we would see for dens down here in Southeast. Most recently, I've collaborated with researchers from Sweden on a global review of brown bear denning ecology. And one of the questions on the survey form that I filled out to describe all of these dens that we've collected information was, is the den located in an anthill? And I can't certainly say I've ever seen one in Southeast in an anthill before. To give you a sense of den timing, I summarized data from the study area in Haines, where the median date of den entrance is in mid-November. I usually expect more than half of the bears to be denned by Thanksgiving, and though it's not uncommon for bears to remain active into December and January when there are salmon and other attractants readily available. Emergence largely occurs in the latter half of April, though it depends on the cohort. Haines, the average elevation for dens is just under 2,500 feet. So here's a figure that kind of breaks that down a little bit more into the cohorts that I was speaking about. So males are at the bottom of the chart in white. Females without cubs are kind of the gray, versus females with cubs are the darker color. At the top of the figure, you see the den entrance dates. Some have been in the den as early as middle of October, leading all the way up into that kind of mid-November period, Thanksgiving, and some as late as December and into January. As we look at the bottom of the figure, you can see the dates of which bears typically emerge from their dens. Some have been in March and early April, but the peak of den emergence is really middle to late April. I had one 3-year-old female one time. She was in the den for 8 months. She was one of those October entry dates and didn't come out until the second week of June. So males are typically the last to enter the den and the first to emerge from their dens in the spring. Females with cubs emerge last and remain near the den site, sometimes as long as July. I've put this blue line on the graph here to kind of show you the trend. And there's been some recent research by Karen Pigeon in Canada that in a long-term data set has shown that as spring temperatures have increased by as much as 4 degrees Celsius, bears have started to shift the dates that they emerge to an earlier time period. So as climate change really takes hold and our springs are becoming warmer and snowfall is certainly variable, it's potentially something that we would see here as things start to warm. This figure depicts the denning duration of North American brown bears, where females are shown in the gray circles, and it shows that they tend to den longer than the males. Bears in more northern climates spend more time denning, likely due to the cooler temperatures and shorter growing periods. So you can see this positive trend as you move up in latitude towards the Arctic. Bears are spending more time in the den. As you move to more southern latitudes, warmer temperatures, bears don't spend as much time in the den. So it's interesting to see the behavior prior to a bear actually entering the den. And it appears to be, I'm going to show you a couple of videos that I put together from some of our collared animals. So at the top, you can see the date. This is here in the latter part of November into December. And you can see that this is a 4-year-old female, and it pauses when she's not moving. And typically that's in the daytime. And you can see that she's at the den by early December. I visited this den last summer, and it was a rock cave den. But you can see this really direct movement pattern, kind of showing her purpose, that she knows that she's heading to den, and it's like a switch turned and off she goes. And within just a matter of days, she's up to where she spends the winter. This next figure is going to show you 20 individual bears collared in 2019. Their video shows behavior prior to den entrance. There are 13 females depicted in various shades of violet, and the green amoebas are the male bears. At the top of the map, you can see the date and the time advance from November 1st, and I ran this through December. And I just think these animations are so cool. You can see that there's a variation in den entrance, kind of like those graphs that I was showing, but here you can really, and I'll play it again, just because it's so fun to, there's so much to take in, but as you see the time move on, you can see some bears have settled down, others are still moving here into December, and yeah, by about New Year's, everybody's kind of in their den for the winter. So on the contrary, let's watch bears come out of their den in the spring. And here we'll see bears emerging from their dens. There's 18 total, 12 of them are females. Again, the same color coding, but I removed the legend just for simplicity. The males are depicted in various shades of green, females are in violet. You'll see the males typically the first to emerge from their dens in the spring. The females with cubs are the last to emerge. When they have young cubs, they may be near the den site June into July. So where do bears den in Southeast? There's so many different den types that we're going to talk about. I'm going to show you a lot of these things. But if you look at a picture like this, that's a kind of a wet and rocky part of Southeast, would you imagine that a bear is going to den there? I certainly wouldn't. You know, they're going to, if they excavate a den, they're going to need soil that's conducive to being able to dig, like we saw in that video. If they're denning in trees, it needs to be the right size, diameter, and potentially species. And so looking at a picture of the typical Southeast place, not everywhere is a great place to den. And we'll kind of show you some of what that looks like. So how do we find these bear dens? The terrain is rugged, and there's two main ways that we've been able to identify them over the last almost 20 years. More than half of the dens that we found are identified by locating them using their GPS collar. Here you can see a cluster of points that are collected during denning, and it includes kind of the 2 days before den entry and after their exit. We use this cluster of locations to identify where the den most likely is located, and then hike into the den to investigate it. And the actual identified den is shown here by the green star. Most of these locations are within 5 to 10 meters of the den site. So it's pretty easy to pick the actual cluster. And then when we're on the ground, we use some clues while we're there. Sometimes we're lucky and the collar even slips from the bear while it's in its den. This den was excavated beneath a large spruce tree that collapsed in a windstorm off the coastline beach of YAKUTAT. The female had given birth to 3 cubs in this den, and you can see the collar where we found it after the 4-foot diameter tree broke off. You can just see this little bit of white circle here in the den. So when we got to this den, it was like, oh my gosh, so there it is. We were actually just going to recover the collar, and lo and behold, learned it was a den site. The other primary method that I use to identify dens is to survey in a fixed wing airplane. I fly at about a 2,000-foot contour just around the edge of the forest line, searching for tracks in the snow, muddy paw prints, or dirt excavations. Here's a fun video of what that survey looks like from a plane. I recently published a paper on denning, and the reviewers who work with bears from all other parts of the world were really surprised that you could actually locate a den in this way. See if you can see it for yourself. Could you see the muddy tracks there in the middle leading away from the den? Once we identify that den, then we take a location and we're able to go back and investigate it in the summer. Sometimes we even catch the bear who's leaving those muddy footprints. And many times bears are fairly lethargic when they emerge from the den, and they remain near the den site for several days. As you can see here, this bear was in and out of its den, and it's just coming back from a spot where it had been resting, that one little kind of muddy spot right behind it, and it's headed back towards the entrance of its den. As you'll see in this video, females with cubs may stay near their den site for several weeks, kind of depending on the size and mobility of the cub. I see several sites that look like this each year. And I've wondered, and I still do, is this one bear or female bear? You can see all of these different diggings and prints going back and forth. I've shown a couple of pictures of that tonight. My first thought was, well, maybe it's a female with cubs that they're now on their first winter alone, and they chose to den in the vicinity of their mom and their siblings. But however, at this site, I was able to track this to a radio collared adult male bear. When we recovered his collar later that summer, I was able to see that he actually exited from the main den in late March and then moved around to these other den excavations. The activity sensor showed a lot of the movement associated with having to dig a new den, and the temperature all of a sudden went from warm 80 to 90 degrees from inside the den to cold outside ambient temperatures, leading me to believe that that first den probably got wet or collapsed and failed, and he dug another den and he spent the next month there. Okay, so what happens after we identify where these dens are? That kind of starts the fun part of trying to find the den on the ground in the summer once the bear has moved on. In the remote dens so that we can't boat or drive to, Hans, our pilot and good friend, finds us a landing zone, hopefully not too far away, and then we hike in from there. This is an example of how we summarize that data that we collect for each den, taking various photographs, identifying things about the habitat type, the surrounding timber type, good general descriptions, elevation, slope, aspect, and some information about each bear. We measure the dimensions of the den opening, the nest bed, the den chamber. You can see from this photo that the den humidity is extremely high, and we often see mushrooms growing in there. It's an example of the data sheet where we record the measurements and describe the den characteristics. It's nice when people are more artistic than I am and create these great renditions of what that den actually looked like, but you can see we're looking for which den type is it, what kind of physical factors are there with slope and elevation. A lot of these are derived from remote sensed products, but we take physical measurements on the ground to sort of ground truth these things that we're able to get from satellite imagery. So now I'm going to, each one is such a unique and kind of personal experience. I'm going to give you an example of one and then kind of walk through a series of den types that we've documented in the coastal rainforest. So I'll start you out with an interesting one here from YAKUTAT. This den was occupied by an adult male in 2009, male 702, second bear that Laverne had caught in YAKUTAT. He denned beneath the root wad of a live hemlock tree, and it extended over to this dead snag. The den chamber was 6 feet by 9 feet, and the nest measured 5.5 feet around. And that nest material was about 8 inches deep. And from there, it was 37.5 inches from the nest to the ceiling. You see that I've labeled this KHANTAAK Island. And that's one of the things that makes this so unique to me, that this bear was captured on the mainland side of YAKUTAT. It spent most of its summer foraging along the YAKUTAT forelands, but come time to den, he swam out to this island and found this old tree that was a combination of this live tree and the snag, and was able to den. So we visited hundreds of dens at this point and find many of them are associated with tree structures, either excavated in the ground beneath large old growth trees, tree root wads, or even sometimes in this instance in tree cavities. Bears use both live and dead trees for denning, and the majority of trees associated with dens were Sitka spruce with a mean diameter at breast height of just more than 1 meter. And the average height of these live spruce trees was about 30 meters. This tree was 9 feet around at my shoulders. It's one of my favorite dens, and I'll tell you why. As you can see here on the top right photo, it's really this narrow entrance where the bear had to essentially shapeshift to find its way in. But as it came into this den, it was a large chamber inside that on the bottom right-hand side, you can see it's shiny. And it's shiny because this den had been used so many years, so many different generations of bears, that it actually polished the sap and the wood on the inside as they came and went from this area, that it was actually like varnished to the touch. The nest was a the inside of the tree was a cavity going up for probably 30 feet. And so a lot of that dead and decaying wood had fallen to the ground. So it was a really soft nest. You can see on the edge of my waders there, kind of this light duff that just stuck to you as you went in there. It was really, and it was like a bunk bed almost, where there was one main nest, and then just up behind it was like another smaller nest. And this had been a den that the collared animal that used it was a female who had 2 cubs. Interestingly, the average size of an entrance to a den is really small. There was little difference in the size of the entrance in the different types of dens. So whether it was excavated under a tree or in a rock cave, the den entrance averages out to about 28 inches wide and about 28 inches tall. We'll talk a little bit about the den nesting material. We would commonly find blueberry bush branches lining the nest of the den. When we would go to find a den, I actually started noticing that in the area surrounding the den site, the area would just be void of blueberry branches. And at that point, I knew we were getting close. Other nesting material that we found in the dens were spruce boughs, willow twigs, alder branches, duff of decayed trees, and along the YAKUTAT forelands, so much of it is sand beach not too far from the ocean that most of these dens were lined with sand. This den, where you can see Laverne perched in front of, was used by a 3-year-old male. This one also happened to be on KHANTAAK Island. And the tree was alive, but it had partially blown over and uplifted its roots. So we call this a root wad den. And the bear den beneath this root wad and made a defined nest of blueberry branches. In YAKUTAT, we also located about a half a dozen dens that were just nests. And it was just a nest on the ground in the forested habitat, as you can see here. All the nest dens that we found were used by adult males and were lined by spruce and blueberry branches. Here I drew a circle around it so you can really see what I'm trying to describe. I envision these bears simply gathering this nesting material, laying down on the ground, and just getting buried into a snow den. The number of days that bears spent in these nest dens tended to be a little bit shorter. It ranged anywhere from 15 days to 4 months. Average was about 3 months. The bear that built this nest in 2012 never denned in 2013 and just kept slowly moving about. That behavior has been seen in other maritime climates like Kodiak Island. When I think of these nest dens, it often reminds me of, and if you ever get the chance to spend a night in a snow cave or explore a den like this, I highly recommend it. One of my first camping trips with my wife, Lori, one of us, I won't say that it wasn't me, forgot to bring the tent poles on a winter camping trip. And so we ended up excavating this great snow den and spent the night in there. And we were as warm as could be and happy just to be outside. And through the years, every time we get a chance to make a den in the yard, and the kids are always asking to spend a night out there. And I can just envision these bears spending months at a time in a place like this. It really can be more comfortable than you'd expect. Here are a couple of vintage photos from Laverne investigating rock cave dens. You can see the view looking out on the left, and he'll have to let us know whose boots those are crawling in to take all these measurements. The cave dens that I've located have been extremely steep and rugged terrain, and I've yet to be able to even hike into one. You can see here on the left and the right, 2 different rock cave den entrances that just kind of treacherous terrain. This is the most typical den that I've observed during the aerial den surveys. And common to these excavated dens, there's steep slopes where the bear just burrows into the hillside, creating a flat terrace on the outside and the entrance, and a tailings pile becomes real evident from where it's excavated that earth. Another example of an excavated den after the bear has popped out. It's steep, it's rugged, it's remote. This female with 2 yearling cubs was just sitting in the warm spring sun as we flew by on this survey. They popped back into the hole and peered out as we flew back down the valley. Another characteristic that is common with so many of these excavated dens is that they're situated in places with a purely spectacular scenic view. This den was excavated beneath the root structure of alder trees, and the mom in this den gave birth to a single cub back in 2020. We hiked down to this one, and it was so hateful that there was no going back up, and we had to get picked up back at the bottom of the valley. This is another excavated den used by a 16-year-old female. Here's the view of Stephanie from inside the den, looking out the den entrance. The year that this bear used the den, she had 2 yearling cubs, and you can just barely see it on the outside. There's berries of mountain ash, which are not common until you get to the more kind of dry places of Southeast. Inside this den, you can see, like you did in that video, evidence of the claws from where she excavated the den. Some of the excavated dens that persist and are reused by bears kind of look like this. When you see that the bear is excavated beneath a large boulder, it sort of acts like a window header in construction. And it makes sense that this would help stabilize that soil above the den. And some of these are commonly reused by different bears. I try to time the aerial surveys to coincide with spring emergence of bears. Good weather, favorable snow conditions, kind of based on local weather station data. And many times we actually observe the bears as they recently pop out of their den. As I mentioned, we typically observe tailings piles from where the den was excavated in the earth. And this photo was actually taken by a deer hunter on Admiralty Island. As he and his son stumbled onto it, wondering what it was. They soon learned that it was a bear den as the bear came charging out of it. So to take all of these different dens and try to consolidate this down into some understanding of what we've learned so far. This chart kind of summarizes the den type data from those dens that we visited and determined the den type for, representing more than 200 dens across Southeast. 68% of those dens were excavated in the ground. And it's not really surprising because this includes a lot of those dens that I observed above tree line on the aerial surveys. 25% of the dens were associated with trees, with most of those being kind of excavated beneath the tree roots, but in some of the more interesting ones inside those tree cavities. 4% were found in rock cavities and 2% were ground nests. Now, when we compare this to Admiralty Island, I put a figure up for this, it's a fairly different picture. A large majority of those dens were permanent dens in rock cavities, and Laverne can tell you chilling stories about bears working through the dens like a trap line in search of other bears to eat. Only about 21% of their dens were associated with trees. 8% were those nest type dens, and only about 8% were excavated in ground. So to summarize kind of the habitat type that we've located dens in across Southeast, the large majority, more than 50%, are up in this alpine shrub habitat. Closed forest represents about 40% of the dens, and small percentages of unvegetated habitat, and a couple of dens in Yakutat were in second growth, where the actual large diameter tree had been logged back in the day, but the stump persisted well enough for the bear to actually still be able to use that for a den. So summarizing some of this data for den sites in Haines, the mean elevation is just under 2,500 feet. And when we look across Southeast, so that's one study area, but when we look at other places, The overall average is 1,800 feet, but it can be very different in different study areas. Like on the Malaspina Glacier, where there aren't many places to den up high, and they're just on the toe slope of where the glacier has pushed forward these kind of large moraines. That's where bears are denning, underneath the alder roots, and sometimes in places where there's kind of persistent permafrost associated with the glacier. I would have known, so this figure that you see here is from the data on the Yakutat foreland side. And I would have never guessed that bears were denning at low elevation, but nearly 40% of those bears were denning below 300 feet. About another third were kind of what you'd envision. Bears are high up on north-facing slopes, but it's not necessarily the case for always using high elevation. Here's kind of a summary of the slopes that bears are selecting for denning. At the lower elevations, such as with the nest dens, there's not much slope, and you can see that kind of on the left side of the figure. And as you can see here, that kind of the average is about, the sweet spot is like 30, 35 degrees is kind of the perfect elevation. And so this combination of slope and elevation is really important as bears decide where to den. I generally assumed that bears denned on that colder north side facing slope to minimize solar effects of snow melting and flooding their dens out in the spring. However, the pattern that you can see here is not so much of north facing slopes. It's more kind of east, northeast, and west, southwest. And I think that's potentially more to do with the directions that are kind of perpendicular to the predominant winds. So as we kind of move towards the end here, winter recreation is continuing to expand, and it's an important part of kind of the winter economy in Southeast, but it's also important for us to identify where these key habitats are so that we can minimize our impacts during this sensitive time period. Disrupting denning bears has the potential to have large energetic costs and a high risk for human life and safety. Bears can be awoken in winter when they're disturbed, and conflicts with skiers has increased over the last 5 years. Disturbance severity increases as that distance to the den site is close, longer durations of disturbance, and kind of the intensity, the frequency of those. This all contributes to the energetic cost of the bear, which can reduce its reproductive success and at times increase den abandonment that we've documented. So now I'll briefly transition into a less descriptive and kind of a more analytical framework for how these types of data can be applied to wildlife management. The objective of this last study was to investigate den site selection and develop a predictive model of alpine denning habitat to help land managers mitigate conflicts with winter recreation, such as heli skiing. We tested a series of hypotheses investigating whether bears selected den sites based on climate features, terrain characteristics, or a combination of both of those to promote the thermal efficiency and maximize their denning duration. We predicted that bears would attempt to reduce energy expenses by selecting habitats that maximize den insulation and avoid wet topographies. This map kind of shows you what this study area looked like. As part of the larger regional assessment of denning ecology in Southeast, I began flying these aerial surveys in Haines in 2015, kind of to identify den locations and inform land managers. You can see our flight lines here outlined in black, and the study area buffered by 1,500 meters to create about 1,000 square kilometer study area. We masked the study area by removing glaciers and permanent snowfields, as well as forested habitats, because dens in the forest would be undetected. This kind of study serves as a snapshot of den sites suitable for detection above the forest line under variable snow conditions. Use some of these fancy equations and models to help understand and describe what is actually going on here. So we took those observed den locations and we used a resource selection function model to investigate den site selection. RSF models are a great way to kind of relate populations to habitat resources and it's a fundamental tool that we've used in quantifying ecology. We describe the relationships between the probability of animal use given various habitat factors. And then we cross-validated the model and found it to have great predictive capabilities. Bears were very specific in the slopes and elevations that they selected for denning. The top model supported the prediction that bears maximize thermal efficiency by selecting terrain that promoted snow insulation in well-drained topographies that prevented den flooding. There was a positive association with vegetation height, as many dens were kind of in shrub cover, likely to maintain that soil stability. And bears preferred less rugged and dry terrains. Here's an example of what the predicted prime denning habitat looks like when it's overlaid on the landscape. You can see that bears are highly selective for specific combinations of slope, elevation, snow loading, and other habitat features. So we've conducted similar assessments of denning habitat in YAKUTAT, where here on the map, red colored terrain has the highest probability for denning, down to blue areas that are essentially non-denning habitat. Specific locations that you can see kind of outlined here, they're confidential under Alaska statute. So these symbols just merely represent the den vicinity rather than the exact location. But I wanted to give you a sense that where these dens are really in these kind of prime habitats as predicted by these combination of climate and terrain variables. Every year I get calls from film production companies asking where they can go out to capture kind of that quintessential shot of the female with cubs coming out of the den for the first time in winter. And it's really important that we are able to kind of protect these places so that we don't end up with widespread disturbance. It's important to put all of this work into a management context because we're faced with the need to kind of balance economic interests for industrial development with the sustainability of wildlife resources. And with projects like this that increase our understanding and awareness of the science behind denning ecology and site selection, we can really greatly enhance that conversation. So the next steps, we've initiated a research project to estimate the population density and abundance in Haines, and this now includes GPS collaring. So with these collars, they'll be valuable to identify kind of some more site-specific den selection patterns that are males versus females, and better understand kind of the distribution of dens across various elevations and slope classes. I'm interested in learning more about developing local snow models and studying the effects of bear age and sex on den type selection. So as we come to the end here, I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of so many different people. To the Tlingit people who've been stewards of this land for so many generations, I'm grateful. And many thanks for my trustworthy field companions, Stephanie Sell, Laverne Beyer, and our pilot, Hans Munich. Without these characters, none of this would be possible. All the previous investigators, our management biologists, our technicians, there's not enough room here to mention everyone who's contributed to this project, but I really think it's important to have a second to really give them thanks. So as we bring this evening to a close, I want to leave you with a sense of hope with this serene image of a snow moon setting over the Chilkat Mountains. And if you look really closely, you just might be able to see a bear getting ready to emerge from its winter den. Thank you.